Robert Kennedy did not plan to hold a starving child that day. He traveled to Mississippi in April 1967 to review government programs. He joined Senator Joseph Clark for a tour to see how anti-poverty efforts were failing in a region crushed by a collapsing cotton economy. In some areas, more than 70% of people struggled far below the poverty line. Federal aid existed on paper, but families still went hungry. Then Kennedy walked into a small, dirt-floored shack in Cleveland, Mississippi. The politics stopped entirely. He saw a toddler sitting on the floor with a swollen belly. Sores marked the boy's skin. The child was picking grains of rice off a dirty surface and eating them one by one. Kennedy got down on one knee, studied the boy closely, and lifted him into his arms. Cameras captured the moment. The country saw a wealthy senator holding a child who looked like he had stepped out of another century. Most people assume that moments like this simply shocked a rich politician into action. They see the famous Kennedy name, the large homes, and the constant winning, and they think the family grew up wrapped only in comfort. But that belief misses the real engine driving Robert Francis Kennedy. His reaction in that Delta shack did not start in 1967. It started over a century earlier in a small Irish village, long before his family saw money or power. Before the national spotlight, Bobby was simply the seventh of 9 children in a loud, intensely driven family. He was born in 1925 into a household that expected massive success. His father, Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., ran their home like a private training ground. Competition was constant. Sailing races cut across the water at their Hyannisport compound. Touch football games filled the lawn, and academic prizes were treated like trophies. Only the absolute best performances drew real praise. Bobby entered this world at a severe disadvantage. Older brothers like Joe Jr. and John had already set an impossibly high bar. Bobby was smaller, quieter, and more studious. In a family built on big personalities, he often called himself the runt of the litter. This was not a casual joke. It revealed how deeply he felt the emotional scarcity in a house where attention was a strictly limited resource. He faced a choice. He could accept a quiet role and fade into the background, or he could scrap harder for space. He chose to fight. He studied more, competed fiercely, and pushed himself to match the relentless tone set by his father. Being the underdog inside his own home trained him to persist under pressure and gave him a deep sensitivity to people who felt overlooked by society. He knew exactly what it meant to fight uphill. And his father made sure all the children understood exactly why they had to fight. Night after night, Bobby sat at the dinner table in their Brookline, Massachusetts mansion and listened to his father talk about hunger. He described the kind of brutal starvation that drives families onto ships and empties entire villages. By the 1920s, money flowed easily through the Kennedy family. Many wealthy families would have softened their origin story, but Joseph did the exact opposite. He kept repeating the same old story about a teenage boy named Patrick Kennedy. In 1848, the potato famine crushed food supplies across Ireland. Patrick faced a terrifying problem in Dunganstown. He could stay and risk starvation, or he could abandon everything familiar and cross the Atlantic. He chose the sea. Ocean travel in the mid-1800s meant weeks on crowded ships with uncertain, dangerous conditions. Patrick stepped onto that boat simply because the alternative looked worse. That single decision altered the family's path forever. When he reached Boston in 1849, nobody welcomed him. Irish immigrants faced open hostility and real barriers in housing and jobs. Signs reading "No Irish Need." Apply hung across the city. Patrick found steady employment as a cooper, making barrels. It was unglamorous work, but it kept him moving forward. He married another immigrant named Bridget Murphy, and they began building a life. Then the story turned hard. In 1858, cholera moved fast through the crowded city and killed Patrick. His death left Bridget totally alone with 4 children and 0 income. This was the exact moment the family could have slipped backward into permanent poverty. Bridget faced a brutal choice between struggling quietly or stepping forward. She chose to fight. She took a modest position working at a stationery and notion shop. She did more than hold the job. Over the next decade, she gained enough ground to own the entire store herself. For a widow in the mid-1800s, gaining that control mattered immensely. The family stopped stalling and began a relentless climb. Joseph Kennedy knew this history perfectly, and he used it deliberately to build an edge inside his children. He wanted them to feel like outsiders. He strengthened the message by visiting the old Irish homestead in Dunganstown, proving the family rise was recent, not ancient history. The message landed early for Bobby. Success could disappear instantly, reputation had to be built, and outsiders always had to push harder. Bobby lived inside 2 worlds. Outside, his family was rising in American society. Inside, dinner stories pulled everyone back to famine ships and crowded streets. That tension created enormous drive. Joseph did not invent this hunger for power. He inherited it, sharpened it, and turned it into a financial machine. He grew up watching his own father, Patrick Joseph Kennedy, run saloons and step into local Boston politics. Joe learned early that power moved quietly. By 1913, he worked as a banker at Columbia Trust, watching patterns and moving fast. During World War I, he shifted into shipbuilding profits. In the 1920s, he went to Hollywood as a fixer, restructuring chaotic film companies like RKO. He tightened costs, improved structure, and extracted massive profits. He entered the volatile stock market. When warning signs appeared in the summer of 1929, Joe did something rare. While other men bragged about easy money, Joe stepped back and pulled millions out. Weeks later, the crash wiped out fortunes, but Joe stood ready with cash. During Prohibition, he positioned himself in the liquor import business, securing brands like Gordon's Gin and Dewar's Scotch once laws shifted. He bought Chicago's Merchandise Mart, building financial weight on a massive scale. He fused this wealth with political machinery by marrying Rose Fitzgerald, the daughter of a major Boston political figure. Joe structured trusts to give his 9 children total financial independence. He freed them to pursue power without worrying about basic survival. Even his own controversial appointment as U.S. ambassador to Britain in 1938 proved how far the family had climbed in 2 generations. He built an unstoppable engine, but he never let his children forget the climb from the immigrant neighborhoods. By the time Bobby stepped into public life, the family legend was fully built into his operating system. Bobby carried that inherited intensity into everything he did. He struggled in school, served in the Navy near the end of World War II, and worked as a lawyer before fiercely managing his brother's political rise. By the time John entered the White House in 1961, Bobby became the Attorney General. He entered one of the most explosive periods in American history. He pushed forward school desegregation orders and doubled voting rights lawsuits to pressure states, blocking black citizens from the ballot. He personally confronted Southern governors trying to stop integration. These actions carried immense political risk, but Bobby refused to stay quiet or move slowly. After his brother's assassination in November 1963, a devastating loss that hit him like a physical blow, his focus shifted sharply. He began fighting aggressively against poverty and hunger. On March 17, 1964, he stood in a crowded hall in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and made comfortable people shift in their seats. He spoke to the friendly sons of St. Patrick, an audience of successful Irish Americans who no longer saw themselves as outsiders. Bobby knew that if he wanted to move them, he had to remind them who they used to be. He pointed back to 1691 Ireland, reminding them that Catholics could not vote, serve on juries, or hold government jobs. Universities and legal careers were completely blocked. He reminded them of the No Irish Need Apply signs in American cities, calling the Irish the first racial minority to face organized discrimination. He built a bridge between the past and the present. The United States was fighting fierce civil rights battles, including disputes involving black garbage truck drivers. Bobby turned the moment into a pressure test. He asked how they could stay silent while others fought the exact same battle their ancestors had endured. He warned against pride becoming complacency. He told them Irish heritage demanded vigorous participation on the side of freedom. He used family memory as a spotlight, asking successful people what they planned to do with the success their ancestors never had. He answered his own question by walking directly into the poorest communities in the country. When Bobby visited the Mississippi Delta in 1967 and held that starving toddler, he did not just take a photograph and leave. He stayed, he listened, and he returned. He sat inside homes and spoke directly with mothers. Poor Black and Hispanic voters had seen politicians offer cheap promises before, but they noticed Bobby showing up again and again. He began linking the poverty in the Delta to broader national failures. During his 1968 campaign speeches, he connected the Irish discrimination his ancestors faced directly to the suffering of Black Americans. He placed his own family story into their struggle. This was not abstract policy. He approached civil rights as the continuation of an older fight against rejection. Voters measured his authenticity and saw his actions match his words. He kept pushing difficult voting rights cases and confronting officials blocking integration. The boy who grew up fighting for attention inside his own family now stood publicly with groups facing total exclusion. Trust took root. By the 1968 Democratic primaries, Bobby won about 90% of the Black vote in key contests. He became a wealthy insider who built incredible credibility with people living far outside his own background. Some observers called him the most trusted white man in Black America. That deep empathy was fully visible during a quiet moment in June 1967. Just weeks after witnessing severe hunger in the Delta, Bobby traveled to Dunganstown, Ireland. He walked slowly toward the small stone cottage his great-grandfather Patrick had fled more than a century earlier. 4 years before, President John F. Kennedy visited this exact spot in pure triumph, smiling under a welcome banner. Bobby arrived carrying fresh grief and a heavy focus on American poverty. He stood on the dirt where his family story began with famine. The contrast was impossible to ignore. In Ireland, the Kennedys ran from starvation. In America, Bobby was fighting hunger from a position of massive power. The plain cottage still stood there, rooted in a time when survival was never guaranteed. Bobby did not give a speech. He just paused, connecting the emotional thread between 1840s Ireland and 1960s America. The memory of hunger did not vanish when the bank accounts grew. It stayed buried, waiting to surface. His daughter, Carrie Kennedy, later explained this exact connection. Standing in front of a crowd, she described a direct line running from the Irish potato famine to her father's lifelong fight for the poor. She knew the fire started long before the turbulent 1960s. Bobby approached injustice not just as a politician, but as a man whose family memory included forced migration and closed doors. Hunger was not a statistic. It was the reason his family existed in America at all. Carrie chose to continue that mission. She became a human rights advocate, leading the RFK Center for Justice and Human Rights to fight political repression and poverty globally. The locations changed, but the core conflict remained identical. People being pushed aside. People see the Kennedy name and think of power, wealth, and tragedy. But long before the grand houses, the family story was forged by hunger, exclusion, and the brutal choice to fight back. Robert F. Kennedy never invented his relentless drive to defend those with nothing. He inherited Edith